When you're trying to diagnose the ills of society, it's hard to know if you're isolating a symptom or a cause. And in the case of what I'm going to be talking about in this video, I think it's both. But as a symptom, it's extremely concerning. And if allowed to continue, it could be really hard to pull back from. Any proliferation of fascism or Nazism is something that most people would find concerning, but what should be just as concerning is the growth of socialist or communist extremism, which for some reason doesn't carry the same stigma. And I think that's one of the first things that we have to confront if we're going to be honest about facing the problem of extremism. We can't denounce just one version of it while being lenient of another. I think there are many reasons why communism hasn't been as aggressively denounced as fascism, but one that stands out for me is that communism has never had to undergo its own Nuremberg trials. Now, the Nuremberg trials were military tribunals that the Allies used to prosecute the leaders of Nazi Germany for crimes against humanity. It was an opportunity for the entire world to get a full disclosure of the horrific actions of that pathological ideology. It stripped Nazism of the pomp and glamour of its political rallies and reduced it to its core ideals of supremacy, oppression, imperialism, and genocide. It was an utter humiliation for the people that installed and enabled that political disorder to devastate the lives of untold millions. The defeat of the Nazi regime and the subsequent denunciation of its leaders through the Nuremberg trials created such a stigma for this repulsive creed that only the most isolated people would dare to promote it in public. But communism hasn't suffered that same stigma. For example, when I visited Berlin, at the site of the Berlin Wall, I discovered that you could buy hammer and sickle emblazoned t-shirts at the very spot where innocent people were gunned down trying to escape the oppressive regime that symbol represents. But you would be hard-pressed to find t-shirts with fascist symbols emblazoned on them in shops anywhere, let alone at popular tourist destinations. Communism has never had to face its Nuremberg humiliation, but that's not for a lack of evidence that should persuade any reasonable person of goodwill to hold it in similar contempt. Communist regimes, leaders, and thinkers are responsible for more deaths either through willful incompetence or deliberate oppression than any other political framework in human history. And we celebrate it in tourist shops as if it's a harmless novelty. So when so-called anti-fascist groups like Antifa characterize themselves as being merely opposed to fascism and nothing else, I get a little vexed, because even a casual glance in their direction reveals that they're actually a militant communist gang presenting themselves as the essential solution to fascism. For a little historical context, Antifa was founded by the German Communist Party, which was running against Hitler's National Socialist Party in the early 1930s. Now, the Nazis employed a gang of thugs who were famously known as the Brown Shirts to intimidate German voters in order to support them in the election. Unsurprisingly, the German Communist Party employed the same tactics, and that's where we get Antifa from. They're the communist equivalent of Hitler's Brown Shirts. But if their only mandate is to oppose fascism, then what's the problem, right? Well, the problem is that they have a very broad and loosely defined understanding of what fascism is. That's why they aggressively protested events like Ben Shapiro speaking at UC Berkeley. If they can label someone like Ben Shapiro, an Orthodox Jew, as a Nazi fascist, then virtually anyone is at risk of similar condemnation. Dartmouth visiting scholar Mark Bray, who wrote the Anti-Fascist Handbook, was recently asked at one of his speaking engagements where he was promoting his book, how a person avoids being labeled a fascist so as to avoid the violent reprisals he was defending in his speech and in his book. His response was to admit that defining a fascist was really difficult, and then he went on to not answer the question or provide any objective criteria that categorizes a person as a fascist. It's worth noting too that defenders of Antifa violence, like Mark Bray, justify their stance based on the premise that fascist activity is now a prolific danger, especially in countries like the United States. But if that were true, you'd think that his speaking tour promoting his ideals of violence against anyone that fits his loose understanding of fascism would have faced some seriously violent opposition from the fascists that are so prevalent. But he didn't. And in fact, I couldn't find any news reports that said that there was any kind of protest against his violent espousals. And yet speakers like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro have had to endure constant antagonistic protests from groups like Antifa. So who exactly is it that we should be worried about? Now, this hostility between communists and fascists has always been kind of bewildering to me, because even though they will insist that they are diametrically opposed to each other, even a cursory understanding of these two political doctrines and the historical implementation of them will poke some pretty big holes in that assertion. And that's weird because we've always been taught that they are polar opposites, fascism on the extreme right and communism on the extreme left. But polar opposites don't tend to agree on as many things as socialism and fascism do. Like with any other spectrum that we know of, if you take whatever exists at opposite ends of that spectrum, what you should find is a dichotomy that has absolutely nothing in common. So for example, take the grayscale spectrum. On opposite ends, you have black and white, and these two colors or intensities of light have nothing in common with each other. White reflects all light and black absorbs all light. Similarly, if communism and fascism were truly polar opposites, we shouldn't be able to find anything in common between them. But what we do find is that they have quite a lot in common, including totalitarianism, state-controlled economies, militarism, propaganda, cult of personality, imperialistic expansionism, nationalism, secret police, correct political think, state-controlled media, infringement on liberties, concentration or labor camps, and a lot of dead people. With so much in common, you'd think that they'd have more reasons to just get along. Setting aside the tongue-in-cheek for a second, this is actually a serious symptom if you're trying to diagnose the health of a society. Whenever extremist political ideologies like these have gained momentum, historically it has been because of some growing infirmity in society. Now, my guess is the number of people who are turning to extremist political ideologies is still a small minority. But what is so alarming is that even with so little support, look at the amount of attention they demand and the amount of disruption they can cause. And so we're distracted from the things that we should be focusing on, and it creates a climate of fear which exacerbates the reasons that people are becoming so polarized to begin with. Prosperity of the middle class is what has always kept this kind of thing at the fringe, but with growing political corruption and crony capitalism, people are starting to get screwed. And out of their poverty, they are turning to extremism for an answer. So what's the solution? Fix the system, create a more just economy, restore confidence in the media and other forms of accountability, and put your iPhone down for long enough to hear your own thoughts rather than this hysterical feedback loop that we all seem to be stuck in. Go outside, have a real conversation with a person or two, and look them in the eye when you speak to them, and resolve to make whatever personal improvements you need to make to interrupt the advancement of this poisonous disease. Thank you guys for watching that. If you enjoyed that, then please like it and share it and subscribe and come follow along for more content. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting the business that makes them possible. Holdsworth Design is a digital marketing and communications company that specializes in web design, print design, branding, videography, and all that kind of stuff. So, and this is with a special emphasis on churches and ministries as well. So if you know somebody that needs those services, then please consider passing that along to them, and check out the website, which is www.holdsworthdesign.com.